G'day there and welcome to today's online service. Thanks for joining us. Wherever you're watching, I hope this finds you well. We're about to jump into some worship with our worship team, but I want to ask the question, why do we worship? Why do you worship? There's probably a whole lot of answers you can tell me right now and behind the purposes of worship, but have you ever considered that worship helps us not to forget? Not to forget the great works that God has done. Not to forget the great God that He is. Not forget the great gifts and the blessings that He has poured out on us, His people. Now, it might seem like ridiculous that we could even possibly forget those things. And yet, if we're honest enough with ourselves, there are times where we get complacent and we forget. Or where worship, one of the other purposes of worship is that it declares the goodness of God, like it speaks in our church vision statement. That is one of the things we want to be. We want to be a people that declare the goodness of God. And I want to read to you a psalm from Psalm 78 to start off with, because later we're going to launch into the book of Judges. We're starting a new series, and that's exactly what happens in the people of God. The generation dies off and they forget the great wonders of God, that He's brought them out of Egypt and done these amazing things in the promised land. That next generation kind of forget their God. It's possible. And so worship helps us to not be complacent, to remind ourselves once again about the goodness of God and who it is that we serve and who it is that loves us and who it is that calls us His son or His daughter. And so let me just read this psalm as we jump into some worship. It says, "O my people, listen to my instructions. Open your ears to what I am saying, for I will speak to you in a parable. I will teach you hidden lessons from our past, stories we have heard and known, stories our ancestors handed down to us. We will not hide these truths from our children. We will tell the next generation about the glorious deeds of the Lord, about His power and His mighty wonders. For he issued His laws to Jacob. He gave His instructions to Israel. He commanded our ancestors to teach them to their children so the next generation might know them, even the children not yet born, and then they in turn will tell their own children. So each generation should set its hope anew on God, not forgetting His glorious miracles and obeying His commands. Then they will not be like our ancestors, stubborn, rebellious, and unfaithful, refusing to give their hearts to God." So come to worship, giving your hearts to God.
Bless the Lord, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. The sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing your song again. Whatever may pass and whatever lies before me, let me be singing when the evening comes. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. You're rich in love and you're slow to anger. Your name is great and your heart is kind. For all your goodness I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart to find. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I'll worship your holy worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I'll worship Your holy name. And on that day when my strength is failing, the end draws near and my time has come. Still my soul will sing Your praise unending. 10,000 years and then forevermore. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I'll worship Your holy name. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I worship Your holy name. I'll worship Your holy name. Lord, I worship Your holy name.
This experiment means you can't see what's happening, but something is happening.
Well, today we start a new series looking at the book of Judges. And if you've ever read the book of Judges, you'll know what I mean when I say it's quite the read. If it was made into a movie or a TV series, I hazard a guess it would be rated R 18 plus, because there is some serious violence in this book and some pretty brutal acts. But more than that, it can be a bit of a disheartening read for a person of God, because it just shows how the people of God stray further and further away from Him, how their disobedience leads to such destruction and chaos. And so it can be quite a disheartening read. So I've kind of wrestled with, well, is now the timing to actually be doing the book of Judges? Because it's been planned for a long time to be now, but should I readjust? But I've become convinced that no, we should still stick at it, because despite there being this clear themes of the destruction that comes from disobedience, it's just come after the book of Joshua, which is kind of the flip side of that coin. It's as they are obedient, as they press into what God is leading them into, He blesses them and blesses them. And yet then we come to the book of Judges and it shows the opposite. As they disobey, the destruction that just comes about. And so even though that's going on, and this desperate need for a deliverer, for a king, just keeps repeating over and over again, there's this strong undercurrent of God's faithfulness, even in the chaos. And so I think there's some great themes for us here to touch on with where we are for us in our lives at the moment. So what would be really helpful is actually if you would read the book of Judges this week. Look, you could in one sitting, you could probably do it in less than 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half or so. If you want to do it over a few sittings, that's fine. But read the whole book this week. That'd be fantastic as we dive into the book of Judges, and then you can do it piece by piece in the weeks after. But that would be really helpful, because today I'm just going to give an overview of the book of Judges, and in the coming weeks we'll pick some of the specific stories apart. But I want to go through the overview in terms of just do it in the way of a few hints for how to understand the book of Judges. And the first hint is be prepared for a sore forehead, because you're going to do plenty of this, plenty of forehead slaps, because Judges is kind of structured around this cycle that the people of God go through. And you're just left shaking your head and slapping your forehead over and over again at the people of God. And let me read to you a bit of a chunk of Judges 2, so bear with it, but it's an important read because it kind of sets up, this is the rhythm, this is the pattern for the rest of this book. And it starts by saying, the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said to the Israelites, I brought you out of Egypt into this land that I swore to give to your ancestors. And I said I would never break my covenant with you. For your part, you were not to make any covenants with the people living in this land. Instead, you were to destroy their altars. But you disobeyed my command. Why did you do this? So now I declare that I will no longer drive out the people living in your land. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a constant temptation to you. After Joshua sent the people away, each of the tribes left to take possession of the land allotted to them. And the Israelites served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the leaders who outlived him, those who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. But the Israelites, after that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshipping the gods of the people around them. They angered the Lord. They abandoned the Lord to serve Baal and the images of Ashtoreth. This made the Lord burn with anger against Israel. So he handed them over to the raiders who stole their possessions. He turned them over to their enemies all around, and they were no longer able to resist them. Every time Israel went out to battle, the Lord fought against them, causing them to be defeated, just as he had warned. And the people were in great distress. So then the Lord would raise up judges and rescue the Israelites from their attackers. Yet Israel did not listen to the judges, but prostituted themselves by worshipping other gods. How quickly they turned away from the path of their ancestors who had walked in obedience in the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge over Israel, he was with that judge and rescued the people from their enemies throughout the judge's lifetime. For the Lord took pity on his people who were burdened by oppression and suffering. But when the judge died, the people returned to their corrupt ways, behaving worse than those who had lived before them. They went after other gods, serving and worshipping them, and they refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. And so in this passage, you see this repeated cycle for the people of God. There is this rebellion. They reject God, and that leads to an oppression by their enemies, because God hands them over and says, all right, well, your enemies have free reign. And so they oppress them, and they steal their possessions and all that kind of thing. So then the people plead to God. They cry out for mercy and forgiveness. And God sends them a deliverer who there is then deliverance for that lifetime of that judge. There's that period of rest while that judge is alive. But as soon as that judge dies, they forget and they again rebel. And then they're oppressed. Then they plead. Then they're delivered. And then there's rest. Then they rebel. Repeat. This is the cycle that will help you understand what's going on in the book of Judges. And a few other things I want to point out from this passage. It says that they got progressively worse. And this is also a rhythm, a pattern you'll see throughout the book of Judges, that the people and even the judges themselves get progressively worse and more corrupt. But one of the statements right at the start, it says that God promised he would never break his covenant with the people. And that is a big theme that you'll see through, an undercurrent really that lies under all of the book of Judges, is the patience and the faithfulness of God. And if you read And we go through this series on Judges, and you are not left more amazed at God and his faithfulness and his patience and just how incredibly he works for the good of his people. Then you've missed something, because it is such a stark contrast to his people who are faithless and disobedient and not patient and not honoring of their covenant to God. And it also highlights the importance of us bearing witness to the goodness of God in our lives and what he's done in us and through us to our generations to come. Because that's what happened for the Israelites. There was this great stuff going on with Joshua and his generation, but as soon as they had passed away, the Israelites forgot the mighty wonders of God. You see, when the people of God are not told the works of God from the word of God, they lose the wonder of God. There's this complacency where they just simply forgot the Lord their God. And so it serves as both a warning for us not to become complacent and an encouragement for us to speak out the goodness of God so that people understand who he is and what he's about. So be prepared for a sore forehead. Second hint is to resist the urge to censor or to make it more palatable. So my kids, when we put a plate of vegetables in front of them, will grab the tomato sauce bottle and drown their vegetables in tomato sauce because they want to make it more palatable. And so my encouragement to you is, as we go through the book of Judges, for the things that will make you uncomfortable, because it will, because Judges is quite in your face. It'll be tempting to smother it in tomato sauce, to make it more palatable, to make it easier for you to digest. But can I urge you to kind of resist that temptation? You see, we're kind of grown up in the generation of Hollywood movies where even though there's uncomfortable situations and things that rise up in those movies, by the end of the hour and a half, 2 hours, there's this nice, neat resolution that has happened that leaves us feeling like, okay, everything is okay with the world again. But Judges doesn't end like that. It ends with them getting progressively worse, more disobedient, more corrupt. And that's where it ends. But the destruction that disobedience brings, I think the point of the book of Judges is for us to feel the weight of that, to understand that. Because just like we need to remember the goodness and to speak out the goodness of God so that we don't forget him, it's important for us to remember also what disobedience feels like, the destruction that brings, so that we don't forget what life without God was like. I probably told you this story, but there was a young adult female that had conversations with her previous church who she was just kind of coming to terms with whether she wanted to believe in Jesus and give her life to this whole kind of Christian faith. And the big question she said to me is like, well, the big sticking point, the stumbling block, when I asked her what was stopping her from making that decision, was that, well, I've got to kind of admit that I'm bad to receive this good life. I just don't think I'm an evil person. And so we spoke about, well, can you see the effects of sin in the world? Like what are around us? Can you see how sin just disrupts what was good at creation? She said, yeah, absolutely. But personally, she struggled to understand her own level of disobedience and rejection of God and how that had played out in her life and in her relationships. And I think Judges helps just bring us back to the point where we need to understand that we too can partake in that cycle. But we need to be walking in obedience with God. So resist the urge to make it more palatable for you, and don't pick a judge as a role model. So we were watching the news the other day, and one of the NRL bosses was on being interviewed, and he said a line something like, well, we like to think of our players as role models. And one of the boys piped up around the dinner table, yeah, they like to think that they are role models, because often the news is something that is not role model worthy about these NRL players. And so the temptation for us as we go through Judges is to see the judges as role models, to think that they are the heroes of these stories, but largely they are not people you want to model your life on. I mean, Gideon, take him for example. He was this kind of really timid, hesitant, almost reluctant judge, constantly kind of checking God. Say, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? And then when he does kind of become obedient and pursue what God is asking, that some great things happen, so much so that the people want to make him ruler, and that his sons then can be rulers over them. Essentially set up the kingdom and you will be the king. But he says, no, the Lord will rule. And so it seems like he's someone to follow, but the very next breath, he demands gold rings from the lute, and then he makes a golden ephod, which the people begin worshipping, and it becomes this massive stumbling block to Gideon and his family. They begin worshipping this golden tunic, this priestly robe made out of these gold rings. Or Samson, I mean, he had a massive problem with women and was driven by lust, and even though his body was strong, his resolve was weak. And so these kind of vows that as a Nazarite he had made, he just step after step undid, to the point where he lost his eyes, he lost his hair, he lost his strength because of his kind of problem with women, essentially. He's driven by his lust. So the real hero of these stories, it's God who delivers. It's not the judges. God is the real hero of the stories, because it says for each of these judges, the Spirit of the Lord was on them, and that's what enabled them to deliver the people of God. So Ehud, it's almost comical how easy it is for him to deliver. Why? Because the Spirit of God was with him. For Shamgar, we don't hear much about him except that he killed 600 Philistines with essentially a cattle prod. Why? Because the Spirit of God was on him. Deborah, in the story of Deborah, the king that they are pursuing, is killed by a woman, Jael, who he happened to stumble in her tent and he was asleep, and she just drove a peg through his head. Because God had led all those situations, even though it seems kind of ridiculous, like a big coincidence, but God had ordained it in a particular way. Gideon, they fight the Midianites with just a trumpet in one hand and a broken jar in the other. Why? Because God had so confused the Midianites, they were turning on each other. They didn't have to really fight them. And for Samson, his strength was given by God. God is the hero of these stories, not the judges themselves. Look, there is some reason to commend them. Hebrews 11 does, in that kind of famous Hall of Faith passage where it talks about it lists a couple of judges. They are part of the cloud of witnesses, but the cloud of witnesses, it says, is to help us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And for that reason, the final tip for understanding Judges is to be alert for what is foreshadowed. If we are to fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, be alert for what is foreshadowed in the book of Judges. Because it appears, and largely it's true, that there appears to be no good news in the book of Judges. And yet there's this undercurrent, as I've said, of the faithfulness of God, that he will not break his covenant, and this rising need for a deliverer. That's part of the cycle. They need this deliverer in these cycles of the generations. But what begins to rise is this need for a deliverer who is not corrupt, who is not deficient, who is not imperfect, someone who is perfect and obedient, someone who is capable of achieving an eternal rest, an eternal peace, and not just for whilst they're alive. But Jesus is still alive, and here is the rest, the peace, because he is the great deliverer. And you see this theme too that we hear in the New Testament rising up in Judges too, where God's power is made perfect in weakness. And it points to the foolishness of the cross. It was a completely unexpected way for God to deliver his people. And yet in this unexpected way, this weak kind of way, that is where the power of God rose up and delivered his people for good. And the book ends with, in those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. And that line is repeated over and over in the final chapters. And that foreshadows what is to come, this period of moving into the kings, Saul and then David, and the David line leading the people of God. But a bigger picture, it foreshadows the King of Kings to come from David's line, where God sends that perfect, obedient deliverer for his people. And so it reinforces this foreshadowing of what to come, reinforces the faithfulness of God in bringing about his purposes despite what we see going on around us. And that, I think, is why I feel like we should continue with this series at this time. Because regardless of what is going on around us, regardless of the destruction that disobedience causes, regardless of just what life is throwing up, God is still bringing about his purposes. His plans have not halted. And so sometimes these are achieved in very unusual and unexpected ways. We can't imagine how God might be at work. And just like in the time of Judges, he is still using flawed people to accomplish his purposes. And so as we go through this book of Judges, I pray it is a blessing to you in some way. God does speak to you in some way. So approach it with an open mind, open heart, and particularly open ears to hear what God might have to say. Because maybe you're just one of the flawed peoples he wants to use to achieve one of his purposes.
Singing, oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know. I am washed, I am drenched in love. Oh, souls atoned by the blood of the Lamb, I'm not a slave to what was held me damned. How beautiful that cleansing flood. I am washed, I am drenched in love. We're singing, oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know. I am washed, I am drenched in love. Oh, filth made clean in that crimson sea, I'm not ashamed of what once shackled me. How infinite that grace divine. I am free, I am a child of God. We're singing, oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know. I am washed, I am drenched in love. Oh, 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 how priceless, how precious, there is power in the blood of Jesus. How priceless, how precious, there is power in the blood of Jesus. How priceless, how precious, there is power in the blood of Jesus. How priceless, how precious, there is power in the blood of Jesus. Power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. I was buried deep with Christ my Lord. Now I'm raised to life forevermore. My name's been carved upon your heart. No, not death, no, not hell could ever rip us apart. We're singing, oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know. I am washed, I am drenched in love. We're singing, oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know. I am washed, I am drenched in love. I am washed, I am drenched in love. I am
So yes, we have moved on from our series on the spiritual gifts, but that doesn't mean we just push that to the side and leave it there and move into Judges now. We still need to act on it. The phrase when it says practice what you preach, that's not just the preacher that has to practice it. All of us are called to practice those things that are spoken to us in Scripture. And so my question, I guess, is did anyone get an opportunity to do a hospitable act this last week? Jump on the Zoom at 10:30 and share it with us. We'd love to hear about how that went and what you did and share those ideas. But maybe it was another gift in the last series that stirred up and you felt God calling you and prompting you to do something about. Don't just let that slide now. Respond to what God led you to. And I think now more than ever, the church, the people of God need to rise up and live out some of this stuff. We've just got news that we're in an extended lockdown till at least mid-September again. And so people are disheartened, people are feeling down, and the church can rise up and be a real voice of hope and love and just those kind acts can actually speak so much more loudly than at other times. So I encourage you to jump into that and think about what are some hospitable acts you might be able to do, some of those kind acts you might be able to do over the coming weeks. But as usual, we've got our ways to connect: the Bible study on Wednesday, the 10:30 Zoom on Sundays for the kids on Sunday nights at 4 p.m. Encourage you to do that, but keep calling one another, and I know soon enough we will be able to see each other face to face, get vaccinated, because it sounds like those of us who get vaccinated might be at least able to have a picnic outside with 5 people, not too distant future. So go and talk to your GP about that, but just know that we are really missing you. We are not having a holiday. We long to be back with you and worshiping our God and encouraging one another. And we'll see you soon, no doubt. But please get in touch if you need anything or if you know anyone that could do with some support. I would love to be able to help out and love on our community as best we can at this time. So God bless you, and we'll see you soon.